The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, always tasted like disappointment and metallic tang. Tonight it was thicker, heavier, like a shroud I hadn't realized I was still wearing. My breath plumed in the chill, the fluorescent bulb buzzing a discordant lullaby above the stainless steel slab. It had been a long time since I'd stood in a place like this, a place where the dead whispered their final stories, and I was supposed to be the one to translate. A souvenir from a case I'd buried deep, a case that seemed to have followed me here into this quiet, sterile purgatory. The voice on the other end, crisp and official, had spoken of a series of incidents that brushed against the edges of my nightmares, the ones that kept me awake staring at the ceiling fan, counting the rotations until dawn. I ran a gloved hand over the cool, smooth surface of the autopsy table. It was empty, thankfully. My current work involved cataloging historical artifacts, a far cry from the visceral reality of human remains. Less blood, less pressure, less failure. But the caller, a representative from my alma mater, had been insistent. They'd used words like unique, unprecedented, and most damningly similar. Similar to that case. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, snaked down my spine. I remembered the frantic energy of those nights, the endless cups of lukewarm coffee, the gnawing certainty that I was missing something crucial. The faces of the victims, etched into my memory like a permanent etching on bone. And the one that got away, the one that broke me. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a place I'd sworn I'd never return to, not after. But the caller's words had lodged themselves in my brain, a persistent, unwelcome guest. We believe your unique expertise, user ooh, is precisely what's needed. They'd practically oozed sympathy, a thinly veiled attempt to lure me back into the world I'd so deliberately excised from my existence. I pulled a crumpled piece of paper from my pocket, the caller's number scrawled on it in hasty print. My knuckles were white as I gripped it. My apartment, with its dusty books and the ever-present scent of old paper, felt a million miles away. Here, the scent was sharper, more immediate. It was the smell of finality, of questions that demanded answers. I tried to build a new life, a quiet life, a life where the ghosts of the past couldn't reach me. I'd convinced myself I was happy, or at least content. A soft click echoed from the far end of the room. I tensed, my head snapping up. The door to the main corridor. I wasn't alone. My heart, against my will, began to pick up a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Not a panicked pounding, but a steady, focused acceleration. The kind that meant the hunt was about to begin. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the nondescript uniform of a county official. He carried a small metal case, its surface glinting under the overhead light. User ooh. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the case. Who are you? The one who's going to show you what we found. He walked towards the slab, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the tiled floor. They said you were the best. Let's see if that's still true. He placed the case on the edge of the table and unlatched it. The contents were not what I expected. No instruments of dissection, no vials of chemicals. Instead, nestled within a velvet lining, were a series of small, intricately carved wooden figurines. Each one was disturbing, depicting a figure contorted in an unnatural pose, their faces frozen in silent screams. They were familiar, too familiar. My breath hitched. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, suddenly felt suffocating. My past, the one I tried so desperately to outrun, had just caught up to me, and it was holding out a very disturbing offering. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet that I knew all too well. My eyes, still adjusting from the harsh glare of the hallway lights, scanned the stainless steel table. It was empty now, scrubbed clean, but the faint discoloration near the drain told its own story. A ghost of what had been. The uniformed officer, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with exhaustion, gestured with a gloved hand. This is where the first one was found. University grounds just off the old Arboretum path. Campus security found him. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the room. It was sparse, functional. The overhead light hummed, casting long, distorted shadows. The tools of the trade were laid out neatly on a cart: scalpels, saws, probes, but they felt inadequate. This wasn't a simple case of blunt force trauma or a botched robbery. The case file, the one the detective had thrust into my hands back in my cramped office, was filled with details that made my gut clench. The symbols, the arrangement of the body. They brought him here first, then? I asked, my voice a little rough. Yeah, standard procedure, the officer replied, his tone flat. He avoided my eyes. Detective Miller's out at the university now, surveying the scene of the second one. Said he wanted you to see this first. Said it was important. Important. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I remembered the call from my old mentor, the urgency in his voice that had cut through the quiet of my self-imposed exile. He hadn't elaborated, just said there was a situation, something that required my unique skill set, and then he'd mentioned the symbols. That's when the ice had started to creep into my veins. I walked over to the drainage grate, my boots squeaking softly on the polished floor. I knelt, peering into the dark opening. Nothing visible now, of course. But the memory of the photographs, the ones I'd deliberately pushed to the back of my mind for years, flashed behind my eyelids. The meticulous, almost artistic placement of objects, the deliberate lacerations. The officer shifted his weight. Just the body and, well, they said something about a mark on the skin, but it was mostly gone by the time the coroner got to it. A mark, of course. It wouldn't be a direct copy, would it? The perpetrator was clever, too clever. What kind of mark? I pressed. He shrugged, a jerky movement. Didn't say. Detective Miller just said it was symbolic. I stood up, running a hand over my face. The sleepless nights, the endless cups of coffee, they were catching up, but there was no time for fatigue, not now. I need to see the second scene, I said, my gaze meeting the officer's for the first time. His eyes were wary, a mixture of curiosity and a distinct lack of trust. Detective Miller said he'd meet you there, the officer replied, pulling out a small radio. He wasn't too happy about you being called in, you know. I gathered, I replied dryly. Miller, always so territorial. He'd been a junior detective when I was still a student, and he hadn't forgotten my contributions to the university's reputation. I'd been a ghost in this town for years, and now I was back, walking into a nightmare that felt all too familiar. The drive to the university was a blur of streetlights and the low thrum of the engine. The campus, usually a bustling hub of activity, was eerily quiet, bathed in the pale glow of security lights. The air outside the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. single overhead light was cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Detective Miller was waiting for me near a cordoned-off section of the arboretum, his arms crossed, his expression grim. He was taller than I remembered, his face a roadmap of late nights and difficult cases. His eyes, however, held a sharp intelligence that I couldn't deny. "User ooh," he answered, his voice clipped. "Glad you could make it, though I'm still not sure why you're here." "My mentor thought I might be of some use," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "And the symbols, they're the same, aren't they?" Miller's jaw tightened. He didn't answer directly, instead nodding towards the yellow tape. "Second victim. He was found by a student out for a late-night run. Campus security secured the area. We haven't touched anything inside." I ducked under the tape, my senses on high alert. The air here was different, tinged with the metallic sweetness I'd recognized in the autopsy suite, but also something else. Something floral, almost cloying. It was the scent of the night-blooming jasmine that used to climb the old library wall. The scene was a small clearing, illuminated by a single, harsh floodlight that had been set up by the responding officers. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves, obscuring much of what might have been there. In the center, however, was the body. A man dressed in the uniform of a university groundskeeper. My gaze immediately went to the chest. A deliberate incision, clean and precise, had been made, and within it, placed with unnerving care, was a small, intricately carved wooden figurine. It was different from the ones in the case file, but the style, the unsettling artistry was unmistakable. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement. This is a pattern. Miller watched me, his expression unreadable. The symbols are the same kind of arrangement. The coroner's initial report from the first one mentioned specific marks on the skin. This one too, they're calling it a signature. A signature, not a mistake, not a random act. This was calculated. This was the past, clawing its way back into the present, and I had a sickening feeling that I was the only one who truly understood the language it was speaking. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, hung thick and metallic, a scent I'd once found comforting, a sign of work, of answers. Now it just felt like a shroud. The chill wasn't just from the stainless steel table. It was bone deep, a familiar companion to this particular kind of investigation. I ran a gloved finger over the faint outline of a symbol etched into the victim's sternum. It was crude, almost amateurish compared to the precision I remembered, but the intent was unmistakable. The same jagged lines, the same unsettling symmetry. "You shouldn't be here, user ooh," a voice rasped from the doorway. The attendant, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with fatigue and the faint scent of formaldehyde, stood silhouetted against the dim hallway light. He carried a clipboard, his posture a silent accusation. I didn't turn. Someone has to be. My voice was rough, unused for hours. I'd spent the day poring over old case files, the faint scent of aging paper a stark contrast to the current sterile environment. The attendant shuffled closer, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. "The captain said you were to stay away from this one. Said it was being handled. The captain isn't the one who saw this symbol 20 years ago on a slab just like this," I retorted, finally turning. My eyes met his, and I saw a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or just weariness. He'd been here then too. A younger man, still with a shock of dark hair, not this thinning gray. 20 years is a long time, he murmured, his gaze drifting to the body on the table. "Not long enough," I said, turning back to my work. I traced the symbol again, feeling the slight indentation under my fingertip. The victim's eyes, wide and staring, seemed to hold a silent question. I felt a phantom ache in my own chest, a ghost of the frustration that had consumed me all those years ago. The library archives were my next stop. I needed to see them again, the photographs, the notes, the dusty evidence bags from the original investigation. I'd been so sure I was close, so close to uncovering the truth, and then, nothing. A dead end, a career implosion. The archivist, a stern woman with spectacles perched on her nose, eyed me with suspicion as I signed the visitor log. "You're user 00, aren't you? Haven't seen you around these parts in a while." Her tone was flat, devoid of warmth. Old grudges, I supposed. When you fall from grace, the climb back is a lonely one. "I'm here for the Bayside ritual murders case files," I stated, pushing the thought of her judgment aside. She huffed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That one, still holding on to that, are you?" She disappeared into the stacks, the scent of old paper and dust growing stronger. When she returned, she placed a thick manila folder on the table. "Be careful, some of those files. They're not in the best condition." I nodded, my hands already reaching for the latch. The first file I opened contained grainy photographs of the original crime scene. The same unsettling arrangement of the body, the same ceremonial daggers, and there, on the victim's forehead, the same symbol, drawn in what looked like dried blood. My breath hitched. It was identical. Not a variation, not a copy, but the same damn mark. I flipped through the pages, my heart a heavy drum against my ribs. Witness statements, autopsy reports, my own frantic notes from that time. I documented every minute detail, every potential lead, every dead end. One particular report caught my eye, a preliminary analysis of trace evidence found at the scene. It mentioned unusual organic compounds, something that couldn't be immediately identified. The report was marked inconclusive. Inconclusive, I muttered, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. That was the polite way of saying we have no idea. I remembered arguing with the lead investigator, a man who dismissed my concerns about the ritualistic nature of the killings, insisting it was a drug-related turf war gone wrong. He'd wanted it closed, and I'd been too green, too eager to prove myself, to push back hard enough. My gaze fell on a discarded piece of paper tucked into the back of the folder. It was a sketch, a rough drawing of a symbol I didn't recognize. It was similar in style to the one on the victims, but more complex with interwoven lines and what looked like an eye at its center. Beneath it, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "The key." The key? What key? My mind raced, sifting through fragments of memory. I remembered a vague mention in one of the old witness statements, something about a secret society, an ancient order. I dismissed it then as the ramblings of a disturbed individual. Now, a wave of unease washed over me. Parallels were too stark to be coincidence. The symbol, the meticulous staging, the hints of something ancient and hidden. This wasn't just a copycat. This was a continuation, and the archivist's words echoed in my mind. Some of those files, they're not in the best condition. What else was hidden in these dusty archives, waiting to be unearthed? The tension in the room thickened, not just with the scent of old paper, but with the palpable weight of a past that refused to stay buried. I looked at the sketch again, the word key burning itself into my memory. This was more than just a symbol, it was a gateway. The fluorescent hum of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a familiar if unwelcome sound. It was the kind of sterile quiet that pressed in on you, amplifying every rustle of plastic, every sigh. I'd spent too many nights in places like this, tracing the silent stories etched into bone. But tonight, the silence felt different, charged with a dread that had been building since the archivist's hushed, urgent call. User ooh, they found another one. The detective's voice, rough with fatigue, had crackled over the phone. Same. Iconography, and they want you now. Another one. The words landed like stones in my gut. I hadn't wanted to believe it, not so soon. Not after the first victim, the unsettling echo of the cold case I'd buried deep, along with so much else. The detective met me at the entrance, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. He didn't offer pleasantries, just a curt nod and a gesture towards the steel doors of the autopsy suite. The body lay on the gleaming steel table, draped in a sheet. The medical examiner, a stoic figure I'd worked with before, was already present, his movements precise and unhurried. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. User ooh. Glad you could make it, he said, his voice low. This one, it's as the detective described. The markings are identical. I walked closer, my breath catching in my throat. The sheet was pulled back, revealing a body that mirrored the unsettling artistry of the first. The same symbol, crudely but deliberately etched onto the skin, marred the chest. It was a tableau designed to provoke, to disturb. My gaze swept over the victim. Younger than the first, perhaps late 20s. Male. Anger at the perpetrator, at the sheer audacity of this desecration, and a flicker of self-recrimination for ever thinking I could outrun this. I needed to detach, to engage the analytical part of my brain, the part that saw patterns, not just tragedy. The medical examiner gestured to the victim's hands. His fingernails, that's different. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the hands. The first victim's nails had been clean, almost manicured, but this man's, his fingernails were ragged, as if he'd been scratching at something with desperate intensity. Soil, not just any soil though. I recognized the texture, the color. It was clay-rich, the kind found in specific geological deposits, not common in the general urban sprawl. What is that? The detective asked, his voice tight. He was standing at the edge of the room, his gaze fixed on the body, but his attention was clearly on me. Soil, I said, my mind already racing. And it's not just random dirt, it's specific. I pointed to a small sample the medical examiner had collected in a sterile bag. See the consistency, the color. This isn't from a park or a construction site. This is from a particular kind of earth, like riverbank sediment or perhaps a localized clay deposit. The detective frowned. So he was digging, or what? Or he was somewhere that soil is prevalent, I corrected, my thoughts coalescing. This wasn't the work of a lone wolf, driven by a singular internal madness. The meticulous staging, the ritualistic elements, those pointed to a deep, personal connection to the symbolism. But the soil, that suggested a location, a shared history perhaps, a place the killer knew and by extension perhaps the victim knew too. I looked at the victim's face again, searching for any flicker of recognition, any clue to his identity beyond the obvious. His ID hadn't been immediately apparent. The detective had said he was an unknown, another ghost in the system. We're running his prints now, the detective said, as if reading my mind. But if he's unregistered, it could take time. The soil, I repeated, turning back to the sample, that's our lead. It narrows down the possibilities. If we can identify the source of this specific soil, we might be able to find where he was before. This was escalating. The killer was growing bolder, more brazen, and the meticulous nature of the crime, the disturbing parallels, the newly discovered clue. This was about something far more intricate, far more dangerous, woven into the very fabric of this place. And I was caught in its threads. The stark, unforgiving beam from the single overhead light in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. carved user OO's world into harsh planes of shadow and sterile white. The air still carried the faint, metallic tang that no amount of ventilation could truly banish. I stood by the stainless steel table, my gaze fixed on the grim tableau that had occupied my last few hours. The recent victim, the meticulous wounds, the disturbing parallels to the cold case, and that newly discovered clue. A small, intricate symbol etched subtly into the bone of the scapula. It all swirled in my mind, a chaotic storm of data points demanding connection. My eyes burned with fatigue, but my brain refused to quiet. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement, a performance. The killer wasn't just taking lives, they were enacting something, following a script. And that script, I was increasingly certain, was buried deep within the history of my alma mater. The physical evidence here, for all its gruesome detail, was only telling me what happened. I gathered my notes, the heavy binder a familiar weight in my hand. The detective had left hours ago, his face a mask of grim frustration. He wanted answers, simple, direct ones. I had none, only more questions, each one a tendril reaching back into the past. The Gothic architecture, usually a source of quiet pride, now seemed to loom ancient and secretive. I bypassed the main administrative buildings, heading straight for the university's historical records department. It was an antiquated wing, tucked away behind the main library, its windows obscured by ivy. The archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on him, nose and fingers stained with ink, looked up with a sigh when I presented my credentials. "User U," he murmured, his voice dry as parchment. I remember always digging where others didn't bother. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either, just an observation. I need access to the university's more unusual historical documents, I explained, trying to keep my voice even. Anything pertaining to esoteric societies, forgotten research projects, or student groups that might have been considered unorthodox. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. We have decades of student clubs, debating societies, chess clubs, even a rather zealous amateur astronomy group. Are I looking for a specific name? No, I admitted, but the ritualistic nature of the recent crimes points to something deeply rooted, something with a specific symbolism. I hesitated, then added specifically, I'm interested in anything from the late 19th or early 20th century, and any records of student disappearances or unusual deaths that were never fully explained. Him fingers, surprisingly nimble, danced across a keyboard. That's a rather broad net, user U. Most student records from that era are physical, not digitized. I'll be here a while. She pointed to a shelf overflowing with dusty ledgers. Start with the societies and guilds ledgers, and the faculty research miscellany boxes. There were a few colorful characters on staff back then. I spent the better part of the morning in that quiet room, the only sound the rustle of brittle paper and my own breathing. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. I sifted through endless lists of forgotten fraternities, academic societies dedicated to obscure languages, and even a brief, ill-fated alchemy and transmutation society that had been swiftly disbanded. Nothing jumped out, nothing mirrored the specific symbols or the precise nature of the wounds. Then, buried deep in a box labeled Faculty Research Miscellany Uncategorized, I found a slim, leather-bound journal. It wasn't official university property. It looked like a personal record, meticulously kept. The script was elegant, almost artistic, but dated from the early 1900s. The author, a former classics professor named Elias Thorne, detailed his private studies into ancient ritual practices and their modern applications. My breath hitched. Thorne wrote about a small, clandestine group he'd formed with a handful of select students, calling themselves the Order of the Obsidian Quill. They met in secret, a place I knew to be a disused boiler room, notoriously difficult to access. Thorne meticulously described a purification ritual involving the scarring of the supplicant's flesh with a specific symbol, the mark of the ancient shepherd, to bind them to the collective will. He even sketched the symbol. It was crude but unmistakable, almost identical to the etching I'd seen on the victim's scapula just hours ago. "Wait," I muttered to myself, my voice raspy in the quiet room. "This doesn't add up." The journal spoke of voluntary scarring, of initiation. The victim in the suite certainly hadn't consented, and the symbol, while similar, had a slight variation, a subtle twist in one of the lines. Was it a mimicry or an evolution? A tremor of doubt ran through me. Was I grasping at straws? Could a century-old secret society, documented in a single, obscure journal, truly be connected to the horrors I was investigating? It felt too neat, too convenient. The killer would have to be intimately familiar with such an obscure piece of university history, or the killer was part of a lineage, a continuation of Thorne's perverse fascination. I closed the journal, my fingers tracing the worn leather. The name Elias Thorne, the Order of the Obsidian Quill, the hidden chamber. This was a lead, a solid one, but it felt like I just tugged on a thread that led into a labyrinth. The tension in the room, which had been a quiet hum, now felt like a taut wire. I wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. I was unearthing a legacy. I needed to find that hidden chamber, and I needed to do it before anyone else did. The dusty archives had yielded little more than a headache and the distinct smell of forgotten ambition. My eyes burned, tracing the faded script of academic societies dedicated to obscure Latin poets and long-defunct debate clubs. Nothing resonated with the chilling precision of the symbols carved into the victims. I'd spent hours there, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights a dull counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my thoughts, until the custodian had politely, but firmly, ushered me out. Frustration was a bitter taste in my mouth, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgent summons that buzzed through my pocket. Another body. Another grim canvas for the killer's twisted artistry. The ride across town was a blur of streetlights and the persistent drumming of rain against the windshield. My mind raced, trying to find a pattern, a connection, anything that could link the cold case from years ago to the horrors unfolding now. The pressure was a physical weight, settling on my shoulders like a shroud. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the chemical bite of disinfectant, a familiar and unwelcome perfume. Under the single, unforgiving overhead light, the latest victim lay exposed, a macabre tableau. The lead detective, a man whose face was etched with too many late nights, gave me a curt nod. "User glad you could make it." His tone was flat, resigned. He gestured towards the stainless steel table. "Same mo, different victim." I didn't reply, my gaze already fixed on the body. A young man, pale and lifeless, his skin unnaturally smooth against the harsh light. My eyes scanned for the telltale marks, the precise incisions that had become the killer's signature. And there they were, on the inside of his left forearm, fresh and angry against the pallor of his flesh. Not just symbols this time, but a series of interlocking lines, almost like a complex knot, unfamiliar yet disturbingly resonant. It was more intricate than the previous victim's markings, suggesting an escalation, a deeper message. The edges were clean, surgical in their precision. This wasn't a frenzied act. It was deliberate, ritualistic, almost devotional. My mind spun, trying to map these new lines onto anything I'd ever encountered in my years studying ancient cultures or forgotten rites. Nothing. A dead end again. Was I missing something fundamental? Was my expertise failing me? Anything stand out? The detective asked, his voice low. Everything, I mumbled, more to myself than to him. The precision, the context, it's all part of a language I don't speak yet. I ran my fingers through my hair, a frustrated gesture. Then I noticed him. Young, probably early 20s, dressed in an oversized, slightly rumpled tweed jacket, clutching a worn, leather-bound notebook. His eyes, wide and earnest, darted between me and the body, a nervous energy radiating from him. I recognized him vaguely, a research assistant, I thought perhaps for the history department, always lurking in the periphery of campus events. What was he doing here in the middle of the night in a place like this? I started, my voice sharper than intended. My focus was on the victim, not on curious onlookers. He flinched, pulling the notebook closer to his chest. My apologies, user the department head sent me, said you might need some context for the symbols. He gestured vaguely at the body, his face pale. I raised an eyebrow. Context? What kind of context? My irritation was palpable. This was hardly a place for academic field trips. I've been studying some of the university's more obscure historical texts, he stammered, his gaze flickering back to the arm. Specifically the founding families and their eccentricities. He paused, taking a shaky breath. That pattern, the interlocking lines, it's not a common symbol, but I've seen it. In the archives, in the founding chancellor's private journals. My attention snapped fully to him. The founding chancellor, what about it? The sheer audacity of a student being here combined with the specificity of his claim was jarring. My initial annoyance warred with a sudden, electrifying jolt of curiosity. It was part of a personal crest, he explained, stepping tentatively into the light. Not the official university seal, but a more personal one, used by a small, exclusive academic society that predates the official university charter. One of them was almost identical to the interlocking lines on the victim's arm. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered seeing that name in the dusty archives, buried in a list of defunct fraternities, dismissed as an archaic, irrelevant social club. Just another forgotten detail. But now, the journal described it as a knot of unbreakable knowledge. The student continued, his voice gaining a fragile confidence. A symbol of their secret pursuit of esoteric truths. They were obsessed with ancient languages, forgotten rituals, and the idea of unlocking hidden wisdom through sacrifice. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide. They believed the university itself was built on a site of particular energetic significance, a nexus of old power. They thought these rituals would tap into it. Sacrifice. It echoed the very nature of the murders. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The ritualistic nature, the specific locations, the age of the university. This student, nervous and unassuming, had just handed me a key. He shrugged, a nervous gesture. I wrote a paper on them last semester, got a C for lack of credible evidence, ironically, but I kept digging. I thought maybe it could help. His gaze met mine, earnest and a little desperate. A reluctant ally, an unexpected, almost irritatingly convenient piece of the puzzle, but why now? Why hadn't this information surfaced earlier? And how did this student, a mere undergraduate, know so much more than the seasoned investigators, than even I had gleaned from the archives? Was he just a dedicated researcher? Or was there something more to his convenient timing, his encyclopedic knowledge of such an obscure, sinister corner of the university's past? The knot of unbreakable knowledge suddenly felt like a noose, tightening around a secret I was only just beginning to uncover. The call came just after midnight, a clipped, urgent voice on the other end telling me another one had been found. Just like that, the fragile piece of my half-sleep shattered. I didn't even bother with a proper coffee, just threw on clothes and drove through the deserted streets, the city lights a blur against the ink-high sky. My mind was already dissecting the possibilities. Dread a cold not in my stomach. 3. It couldn't be a coincidence anymore. I arrived at the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light casting long, grotesque shadows. The sterile scent of disinfectant and something metallic, unmistakably blood, hit me first. The medical examiner, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and perpetually tired shoulders, was already poised at the stainless steel table, her gloved hands resting on the sheet-draped form. The detective who'd been dogging my heels since I got back to town stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face a mask of weary frustration. "User ooh," the medical examiner greeted, his voice flat. "Glad you could make it. This one's a bit different." My gaze was fixed on the hump beneath the sheet. Different how? I walked closer, my boots echoing on the tiled floor. This was my world, the world of the dead, and it always felt most alive when the living were asleep. The medical examiner lifted the sheet. My breath hitched. The victim was a woman mid-20s like the others, but this time the precision, the ritualistic placement, it felt intensified. Her body was positioned identically to the previous two, supine, arms extended, palms up. But this time something new had been added. The wound itself, a clean, deep incision, mirrored the others, a single, decisive stroke. Found her near the old observatory on campus. The detective supplied, his voice low. Same setup. No ID, but campus security recognized her from a missing persons report filed yesterday afternoon. A grad student, history department. Name was Alana. Alana. Another student. Another connection to the university, specifically the humanities. The first was literature, the second philosophy, now history. It wasn't just random targets. There was a pattern emerging, clearer than the stark light overhead. I leaned over the body, my eyes tracing every detail. The skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh light. No defensive wounds, just like the others. Sedation or an overwhelming surprise attack. My fingers, still gloved, hovered above the small wooden bird. It wasn't just a simple carving, it had a distinct shape, a specific type of bird. Not a common sparrow or robin. The medical examiner nodded. "Full photography, we haven't touched it yet, waiting for eye." I gently, so gently nudged the owl with the tip of my gloved finger. It was lightweight, polished, smooth. I pulled a small, powerful penlight from my kit, illuminating the tiny carving. It wasn't a name or a date, it was a symbol. 3 interlocking triangles forming a larger triangle. It was familiar, nagging at the edges of my memory. I'd seen it before, but where? "Anything else?" I asked, straightening up. My gaze sweeping the body again, searching for the different detail the medical examiner mentioned. "Her left hand," the medical examiner said, pointing. I looked. Her fingers were splayed, but the middle finger of her left hand was slightly bent, almost as if clutching something, though nothing was there. More than that, the skin around the nail bed was faintly discolored, a subtle bruising. "He was holding something," I murmured, leaning closer. "Something small," and she clutched it hard. "We checked," the detective chimed in. "Nothing in her hand when we found her. Forensics swept the scene too. Nothing." My mind raced. If he was clutching something and it wasn't there, it meant it was either taken or it disintegrated or it was so insignificant it was overlooked. But given the killer's meticulous nature, nothing was insignificant. Then I saw it. A tiny fragment, almost a speck, caught beneath the nail of that same middle finger. It was so small, I almost dismissed it as dirt, but my gut screamed otherwise. "Look here," I responded, pointing with my penlight. Under the nail, a fragment. The medical examiner squinted. "Good eye, user ooh, we'll extract it, but I doubt it's much." I straightened, the pieces beginning to click into place even as doubt gnawed at me. Is this really it? Am I overthinking? But the feeling was too strong. The owl, the symbol, the fragment, the sacrifice from the previous chapter echoed in my head, now amplified. "The owl," I added, turning to the medical examiner. Is there any particular significance to that type of carving? She shrugged. Could be anything. Symbol of wisdom, night, death, depends on the culture. No, I countered, shaking my head. This isn't just any owl, it's a specific type, and that symbol on its base. I know it, or I should know it. My memory was a frustrating, swirling fog, the answer just out of reach. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the university's old library, the dusty archives, the forgotten corners of its history, the founders, the early societies, the secrets. The university was old, steeped in tradition, and tradition often meant secrets buried deep. The fragment under the nail, the owl, the symbol, the locations of the bodies all on campus near specific older buildings. The observatory, the philosophy hall, the literature building. What did they have in common beyond being old? Suddenly, it hit me, not with a gentle tap but with the force of a battering ram. The three interlocking triangles. I had seen it, in an old, forgotten text. Not just any text, but one detailing the early history of the university, specifically a contentious period involving the expulsion of certain faculty members and the suppression of a student movement. A group, a secret society perhaps, that had been purged from the university's official history. They called themselves the Triad of Truth. Their symbol was exactly that, and the owl. The specific type of owl, I remembered now, was associated with an obscure ancient Greek cult of wisdom and hidden knowledge, one that the Triad of Truth had supposedly drawn inspiration from. It wasn't just a generic owl, it was their owl. The fragment, I answered, my voice rising with a sudden, electrifying certainty. I think I know what it is, and I think it's the key. I looked at the medical examiner, then the detective, their faces etched with impatience and skepticism. It's not wood, it's a piece of a plant, a root, a specific kind of root that was historically used for a very particular purpose in ancient rituals. It's called mandrake. A gasp escaped the medical examiner. Its root often resembled a human figure. Mandrake, I repeated, the word hanging heavy in the stark air. And the Triad of Truth. They believed in a form of sacred knowledge that required a purging, a sacrifice to reveal hidden truths. They were active in the late 1800s, right around the time the university was expanding rapidly and consolidating power. There was a scandal hushed up about students disappearing, faculty accused of heresy. My mind spun, connecting the dots with dizzying speed. The ritualistic nature, the specific locations now made horrifying sense. Each location corresponded to a known meeting place or significant event involving the Triad of Truth. The observatory was where they were said to have performed their celestial observations. The philosophy hall was where their leader, a charismatic but radical professor, taught. And the literature building had housed the printing press they used for their manifestos. This wasn't just a random serial killer. The victims weren't just students. They were proxies, sacrifices to a historical wrong or perhaps a twisted homage to a forgotten ideology. But why now? And who was behind it? The tension in the room was palpable, not just from the grim discovery but from the sudden, terrifying clarity of the pattern. The mystery hadn't just deepened. It had become a living, breathing entity, reaching out from the past to claim new victims. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had just stumbled onto a truth far more dangerous than I could have imagined. And it was only just beginning. The sterile chill of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, bit at my skin. It was a stark, almost theatrical illumination, casting sharp shadows that danced with every slight shift of my weight. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something deeper, that no amount of scrubbing could erase. I stood beside one of the stainless steel tables, not examining a body, but a collection of crime scene photos spread out like a macabre deck of cards. Each image screamed of the Triad of Truth, of symbols I'd spent a sleepless night trying to unpick, of a past that had clawed its way back into my present. My mind was a coiled spring, taut with the connections I'd made. The observatory, the old library archives, the abandoned clock tower, each location wasn't just random. They were the very foundations, the rumored meeting points, the sacred spaces of the triad. The ritualistic elements, the specific arrangement of the bodies, it all pointed to an intimate knowledge of their lore. And that knowledge, I was convinced, resided with one person in particular. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The scuff of shoes, the low murmur of voices, the shift in the air pressure, I'd been expecting them. User ooh. The detective's voice was gravelly, tired. The curator is here. I finally turned, my gaze locking onto the figure standing hesitantly in the doorway. The curator, a title that once conjured images of quiet erudition, now felt laced with a sinister potential. They stood there, a tweed jacket looking oddly out of place in the stark, utilitarian room. I waved a hand towards the empty stool by the table. Please make myself comfortable. The curator moved with a stiff reluctance, settling onto the stool. They avoided my gaze, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route, or perhaps for a hidden camera. I watched them, my own internal alarms blaring. The curator had been a known associate of the triad, a scholar deeply engrossed in the university's more esoteric histories. They had access, knowledge, and a motive that was still nebulous but felt increasingly present. We need to talk about the triad of truth. I began, no preamble, no softening. I picked up one of the photos, a close-up of the victim at the observatory, the intricate carving on the chest. This isn't just some random cult. This is a deliberate, highly specific reenactment, a ritual based on the triad's practices. The curator flinched, a subtle tightening around their mouth. I'm merely an academic, user ooh. I study these things. The single light above cast my face in stark relief, probably making me look more formidable than I felt. You wrote the definitive paper on their initiation rites. You documented their sacred locations, their symbols, their internal power struggles. Historical research. The curator insisted, their gaze finally meeting mine, a flicker of indignation in their eyes. It's all publicly available, if you know where to look. The first victim was found there, arranged in the precise manner described in your monograph on their ascension rituals. The curator swallowed hard, their Adam's apple bobbing. A coincidence, perhaps, or a deranged individual who also read my work. I published it, user ooh, it's out there. And the specific sequence of locations, the library archives where they stored their foundational texts, the clock tower where they supposedly conducted their time-binding ceremonies. I laid out the photos, one after another, creating a grim tableau. You're telling me someone just happened to pick these places in this order, knew the exact rituals to match? A long silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the hum of the ventilation system. Then they let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. You're right, the curator finally conceded, their voice barely audible. It's not a coincidence, but you're looking at it all wrong. I waited, my breath held. This was it, the crack in the facade. The triad of truth, the curator began, picking up a photo of the carved symbol. It wasn't a monolithic entity, user ooh. Not always. There were factions, ideological differences. Some believed in a purely academic pursuit of knowledge. Others sought to apply it, to manifest it. And then there were the splinter groups. The ones who twisted the original intent, who saw power where there was supposed to be enlightenment. My brows furrowed. The groups, what are you talking about? After the original founders disbanded, there was a schism, the curator explained, their voice gaining a strange, almost lecturing tone as if they were back in a seminar. A group who called themselves the Resurgents. They believed the triad's knowledge should be used to cleanse the impure, to restore a perceived golden age of the university. Their rituals were far more brutal. This wasn't the confession I'd anticipated. This was a diversion, a meticulously crafted narrative designed to shift blame, to complicate the picture. Was it true? Or was it a deliberate misdirection, a cunning way to make the killer seem like a rogue element, an extremist rather than a core member? I rest saying this killer is one of the Resurgents. I asked, my voice flat. The curator nodded, their eyes now holding a strange, almost triumphant glint. Precisely. Someone who misunderstood the texts, who took the metaphors literally. someone who would pervert the true meaning of the triad's work. I felt a surge of frustration, hot and sharp. It was too neat, too convenient. It neatly distanced the current atrocities from the pure academic pursuit the curator claimed to represent. And yet, the curator's knowledge of these splinter groups, this internal history, was specific. Could I dismiss it entirely? My mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with the directness of the previous connections. Any leads on these resurgents? The curator hesitated, then shook their head slowly. They were very secretive. A few coded entries in student diaries hinting at their existence. Nothing concrete, I'm afraid. Nothing concrete. The curator had given me an answer, but it felt less like a revelation and more like a carefully placed obstacle. They had provided an explanation that simultaneously confirmed my theory about the triad's involvement, yet simultaneously absolved themselves and anyone directly associated with the main group. Was this truly the work of a misguided splinter group? Or was it the work of someone who knew the triad's lore so intimately they could craft a perfect illusion of misinterpretation? Had I been too quick to connect the dots, too eager to find a pattern? Had I underestimated the killer's cunning, allowing myself to be led down a path of manufactured complexity? The single overhead light seemed to intensify, burning into my eyes, leaving me with a blinding array of possibilities, an gnawing sense that I was still far from the truth. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. single overhead light was cold, not just from the refrigeration units, but from a deeper, more pervasive chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The single overhead light hummed, casting stark shadows that danced with every slight movement I made. It was just me, the quiet whir of machinery and the ghosts of my own failures. I had spread out the evidence photos on the stainless steel table, arranging them in a chronological sequence, then by victim. 3 from then, 3 from now. A morbid mirroring. Triad, I murmured, tracing the faint outline of a symbol in one of the older photos. It was crudely carved into the victim's sternum, almost an afterthought. But in the recent cases, the carvings were precise, deliberate, almost artistic in their brutality. They were evolving, or rather, the killer was refining their craft. I picked up the evidence bag containing the small, dried-out twig bundle found near the second recent victim. A ritualistic offering, perhaps. The curator's evasive answers about the triad's historical practices had only fueled my suspicion that this wasn't just a copycat. This was something deeper, something connected. The position of the body, the small, carefully placed stones around the head, a pattern I hadn't fully grasped back then, dismissed as part of the killer's disturbed psyche. The recent victims were found in similar, if not identical, positions. One with river stones, another with dried herbs, the third with small, intricate bone fragments. I remembered. All elements that could be found within the campus grounds or nearby wilderness. Local, accessible, but imbued with specific symbolic weight if I knew what to look for. I remembered the curator's words about the triad's historical texts, specifically a passage about the 3 offerings to bridge the veil. At the time, I dismissed it as academic esoterica. Now, it felt like a blueprint. My gaze drifted to the first recent victim, the young student whose body had been found near the old observatory. Her hands were clasped over her chest, not in prayer, but holding a small, polished piece of obsidian. The next victim, the linguistics professor, had been discovered near the river, a bundle of reeds laid across his throat. Obsidian, reeds, oak leaves. Earth, water, fire, elements. Not just elements, but specific elements tied to ancient practices of communication, of crossing boundaries. The triad wasn't just a secret society, it was a legacy of philosophy. I began to arrange the photos again, this time aligning them not by chronology but by these symbolic offerings. The second, water. The third, fire. And the recent ones mirrored them perfectly. It wasn't just a copycat, it was an invocation. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the focused determination that usually armored me against such things. This wasn't just about killing, It was about using the victims. They weren't just targets, they were components. But components for what? I leaned closer to the photos of the recent victims, specifically their faces. The expression on the student's face was one of profound peace, almost serenity, despite the violence inflicted. The professor's was similar. The archivist's, however, was different, a deviation. "Wait," I muttered, pushing the photos around again. "That doesn't add up. If the ritual was meant to be perfectly replicated, why the difference in the archivist's expression? Why the struggle? What if the killer then, or someone else, had botched it? And this new killer, perhaps a devotee, was trying to finish it, to correct the past failure." This thought hit me like a physical blow. It shifted everything. The failed prelude, and these new murders were the attempt to rectify that failure. Subtle differences, almost imperceptible unless I was looking for them. A slight misalignment of stones here, a different type of plant there. Errors, perhaps, that rendered the original ritual incomplete. The killer's ultimate goal wasn't just to mimic, but to perfect. To achieve whatever the original ritual was meant to achieve. And the significance of the victims. The student, the professor, the archivist. What did they represent beyond their elemental associations? The student, youth, potential, a blank slate. The professor, knowledge, intellect, communication. The archivist, history, memory, the past. The first victim, a young research assistant. The second, a philosophy lecturer. The third, a librarian. "Oh no," I breathed, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. It wasn't just their elemental connection. It was their symbolic roles within the academic sphere. The research assistant, the lecturer, the librarian parallel to the student, the professor, the archivist. They were all conduits, vessels for specific aspects of the university's collective mind. The triad, I recalled from my own research, was obsessed with the concept of pure knowledge and unveiling hidden truths. What if the ritual was designed to harvest these qualities, to draw out the essence of youth, intellect, and memory, to combine them into something else? The curator's words echoed, a bridge between worlds. The hairs on my arm stood on end. The killer wasn't just a murderer, they were a zealous practitioner. They weren't just taking lives, they were performing a sacrifice, attempting to complete a ritual that had been left unfinished for years. A ritual to bridge worlds, to uncover hidden truths, perhaps even to bring something back. This was the revelation. The victims were chosen not for who they were as individuals, but for what they represented symbolically within the academic framework that the killer believed was vital to their ultimate goal. The current victims were the refined, desperate effort to finally succeed. My own failure to grasp this years ago, to see past the immediate horror and into the ritual's deeper meaning, felt like a fresh wound. I had missed the pattern, the intent. I had dismissed it as madness, when it was, in the killer's mind, a sacred, scientific undertaking. The stakes suddenly felt impossibly high. This wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about stopping an invocation. And if the killer was correcting past mistakes, it meant they were learning, adapting, which meant they were closer than ever to achieving their horrifying objective. I pushed away from the table, the cold metal biting into my palms. I had deciphered the ritual's purpose, the killer's terrifying ambition, and the true, symbolic significance of the victims. What kind of truth were they trying to unveil? And what would be the cost if they succeeded? My mind reeled, trying to connect this ritual to the triad's obscure history, to the very foundations of the alma mater itself. This wasn't just a series of murders. It was a countdown to something catastrophic. And I was standing in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, with only a pile of gruesome photos and a terrible understanding as my guide. The chill of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light was a familiar companion, a stark contrast to the humid breath of the city outside. I stood over the latest victim, a young researcher from the botany department, her body laid out on the stainless steel table. The single overhead light cast a harsh, unwavering glare, illuminating every detail, every incision made by the medical examiner, every dark bruise. My eyes scanned the skeletal structure, the exposed bone where the flesh had been meticulously removed by the previous examination. The killer wasn't just a murderer, they were a zealous practitioner. They weren't just taking lives, they were performing a sacrifice, attempting to complete a ritual that had been left unfinished for years. A ritual to bridge worlds, to uncover hidden truths, perhaps, but what truths and what bridge? I traced the line of the scapula, then the clavicle, my gloved fingers gently probing. The medical examiner had focused on cause of death, on internal trauma, on the obvious. My training, my cursed gift, was to see beyond the obvious into the narrative of the bones themselves. I was looking for the missing piece, the final flourish, the unseen part of the ritual that would tie it all together. Then I saw it. Not on the surface, not readily apparent. A tiny, almost microscopic etching, hidden beneath a sliver of connective tissue that had been pulled back but not fully excised. It was on the anterior surface of the sternum, right over where the heart would have been. A faint, intricate symbol, no bigger than my thumbnail. This one felt different, newer, more personal. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the air above the remains. The symbol was a stylized representation of an eye, but with a jagged, almost broken line running through it, like a tear or a scar. It was unsettling. It wasn't a mark of devotion, it was a mark of something else entirely. As I carefully cleaned around it with a sterile swab, a memory pricked at the back of my mind. A flash of a dusty folder, a grainy photograph. No, the ones that had nearly ended my career. There it was. Not on a victim's body, not on a crime scene photo, but on a personal possession. It had been engraved with that exact same symbol. I'd kept a detailed sketch of it in my personal notes, convinced it was a key, but I'd never been able to place it, never found a match in any known iconography. The official report had dismissed it as a meaningless trinket. That locket, that symbol, was unique to my own investigation, a detail I'd never shared, never published. It wasn't public knowledge. If this killer was etching it onto this victim, it meant they knew my work. They knew my specific findings, my specific fixations from years ago. They knew me. A tremor started in my hands, a jolt of ice water through my veins. The hunter, I realized with a sickening lurch, had just become the hunted. I wasn't just investigating a series of murders anymore. I was part of the narrative. I left the morgue in a daze, the fluorescent hum and the antiseptic smell clinging to my clothes. The city outside was just beginning to stir, a gray pre-dawn light smudging the horizon. My old sedan felt like a metal coffin as I drove back to the university, my mind racing. The broken eye, a warning, a challenge or a claim. I parked near the anthropology building, the campus deserted save for a few early rising students heading to the library. My office was on the 3rd floor. I took the stairs, needing the physical exertion to ground myself. Each step echoed in the quiet hall, a drumbeat against the frantic pounding in my chest. When I reached my door, I stopped short. The door wasn't locked. I always locked it, always. A faint click, almost imperceptible as I'd pulled it shut last night. My breath hitched. I pushed it open slowly, my hand hovering over the pepper spray I always kept in my pocket. A faint scent hung in the air, something metallic like old pennies mixed with a sickly sweet floral note. I flipped the light switch. The overhead fluorescent flickered to life, buzzing loudly, casting a yellow glow over my cluttered workspace. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. My desk was still piled with journals, my whiteboard covered in scribbled theories and timelines. On the precise center of my desk, atop a stack of papers I'd been meaning to grade, was my old, worn copy of The Golden Bough. It was a book I cherished, a foundational text in my field, and I hadn't touched it in weeks. And resting on its open pages, perfectly centered, was a single, dried gladiolus flower, its petals brittle and brown. And carved into the spine of the book, stark against the faded green fabric, was the broken eye symbol. The exact same one I'd just found on the victim's sternum. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't just a message, it was a declaration. The killer had been in my office. They knew where I worked, what I read, what I thought. They were telling me they were watching, They were telling me I was next. I felt an invisible gaze on me, a presence in the empty hallways of the university. This wasn't just about solving the murders anymore. This was personal, and I was standing right in the middle of their twisted ritual. I was the next sacrifice, or perhaps the final piece in their horrifying puzzle. I looked at the symbol, then around my office, a sudden, terrifying suspicion blooming in my mind. Had they left anything else? Had they left something for me to find? Or was this merely the beginning of the hunt? I grabbed my bag, my mind racing through escape routes, through potential allies, through every single face I'd encountered since returning to this cursed campus. The metallic tang in the air suddenly felt like the taste of blood in my own mouth. The game had changed, and I had no idea how to play. A small, tarnished silver pin. Not just any pin, but one I recognized from old university archives. A crest design that hadn't been used since before my time, certainly not since the cold case victims walked these halls. My breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a signature, a mocking echo across decades. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a chilling clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion. It wasn't just a copycat, it was deeper, more personal. A detail I'd dismissed as an antique affectation. Now it screamed. My mind raced, connecting dots I'd stubbornly refused to acknowledge. The ritualistic elements, the specific academic texts referenced in the original case, files texts only a handful of people still specialized in. The meticulous precision. It all pointed to someone steeped in the university's history, someone with access, someone who understood the symbolism intimately. Someone who had been there, or at least intimately connected to the original events. I didn't call the detective. Not yet. This was mine to confront, a ghost I had to lay to rest myself. I knew where I had to go. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. The sterile hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, a low drone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. My footsteps echoed on the tiled floor as I pushed through the swinging door, the air inside sharp with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something I couldn't quite place. And there he was. His back was to me, his shoulders slightly hunched. He was staring down at something on the table, something I couldn't quite see from the doorway. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but my voice, when it came, was steady, a low, controlled current of accusation. I were not supposed to be here. He stiffened, slowly turning. The single light caught the faint gleam of the tarnished silver pin on his lapel. My stomach clenched. "User ooh," he responded, his voice smooth, betraying nothing. "A bit late for a visit, isn't it? Lost something." His eyes flickered to the table, then back to me, a calculated gesture. I walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from him, forcing myself to look at what lay on the table. It was the latest victim, or what remained. The medical examiner's instruments were laid out neatly beside the body, glinting in the stark light. But it wasn't the victim that caught my eye, the one that matches the original university crest, the one you wear. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "A family heirloom," he stated, his voice still even, but a subtle tremor ran through it, passed down for generations. My great-uncle was one of the university's founding scholars, a fascinating man, actually. He penned many of the original texts on ancient rituals that you've been examining. My gaze dropped to the open journal. I recognized the script. It was his great-uncle's, but what was it doing here in the middle of a modern crime scene with him? And this, I gestured to the journal. "Another heirloom or your playbook?" He chuckled, a dry, brittle sound that grated on my nerves. "User ooh, you always were too clever for your own good, too quick to jump to conclusions." He paused, his gaze hardening, or perhaps not quick enough in the past. That hit me. Had I been wrong all these years? Had I missed something so obvious? Had my own ego clouded my judgment, allowing this to happen again? No, the methods, the symbolism, I weren't just mimicking where I was finishing. He finally looked away from me, his eyes drifting back to the journal, a strange reverence in his gaze. Finishing, correcting, perfecting. He picked up the journal, his fingers tracing the ancient script. My great uncle, he was a visionary. He understood the true power of these ancient rites, but he was limited by his time, by his peers. The first victims, they were his attempts. Flawed, incomplete, he almost succeeded. But then I came along, poking and prodding, closing off his work. He was a sacrifice, and my great uncle was the killer. He smiled, a slow, unsettling twist of his lips. He never got to complete the final stage. The convergence, the ultimate revelation. When I reopened the case, user Ooh, I saw my chance to honor his work, to prove him right, to complete what he began. He took a step towards me, the journal clutched in his hand like a sacred text, and I chose subjects who were appropriate, those who had lost their way, those who contributed nothing to the purity of academic pursuit. They were merely vessels, user Ooh, necessary components for the grand design. I killed them. I stated, the words flat, heavy. All of them, to finish my great-uncle's work, to fulfill his twisted vision. Twisted. He scoffed, his voice rising, betraying the first crack in his control. It is truth, user Ooh, a profound truth that I, with my narrow forensic gaze, could never comprehend. I simply picked up where he left off. And this time no one would stop me, a place of transformation, and I am its high priest. His eyes, burning with a manic zeal, landed on me. And I, user Ooh, I was merely a catalyst. My failure was my opportunity, my return a sign. I led me back to the texts, back to the method. I even provided the perfect setting for the final act. He took another step, his hand dipping into his jacket pocket. A ritual needs its final offering after all. My eyes darted to his hand, then to the tools on the table. I knew what he was capable of, what he had done. I had seen the evidence, piece by horrific piece. He wouldn't get his final offering. Not tonight. Not ever again. The stark overhead light in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. usually felt like a surgical spotlight, isolating and revealing. Tonight, it felt more like an interrogation lamp, burning into the raw edges of my consciousness. The metallic tang of disinfectant, typically a comforting scent of order, now mingled with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of fear that hadn't entirely dissipated. I watched as the detective cuffed the professor, his movements precise, practiced. The professor, for his part, offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, fixed on some internal horror I couldn't fathom. He was still holding the bone chisel, a tool meant for delicate work on skeletal remains, but which he had intended for something far more gruesome. My own hand still throbbed faintly from where I deflected his initial lunge, the cold steel of the gurney providing a desperate shield. The sound of his final, guttural snarl, a sound stripped of all academic pretense, still echoed in the sterile quiet. My heart, though no longer slamming against my ribs, felt heavy like a stone dragged from a deep well. It was over. The last offering wouldn't be made. Not by him, not ever again. User Ooh, the detective said, his voice low, pulling me from the immediate past. Are I all right? I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Just processing. He studied me for a moment, then looked at the professor being led away. He confessed. Everything. The first victim, the subsequent ones, the ritualistic elements. Not just the confession, but the casual cruelty of it, the calculated manipulation. He hadn't just committed heinous acts, he had orchestrated my failure, orchestrated my return, all for some twisted academic game. My gaze drifted to the stainless steel table, the array of tools, the faint outline of where a body had lain hours earlier. The air itself seemed to hum with the ghosts of the victims, their fragmented stories finally coalescing into a horrifying truth. The professor wasn't just recreating the ancient rituals he'd studied. He was completing them, striving for some grotesque academic perfection, a final macabre dissertation on the nature of sacrifice, using real lives as his footnotes. It was his genesis, his first foray into this depravity, carefully concealed beneath layers of academic prestige and a meticulously crafted alibi. He had been watching me even then, knowing my weaknesses, my obsessions. He'd seen me close to the truth once and had built an elaborate, bloody distraction to ensure I never got that close again. A wave of nausea washed over me, not from the gore or the violence, but from the sheer, soul-crushing betrayal. This was someone I had respected, someone whose brilliance I had once admired, someone who had shaped the very institution I called home. He had worn a mask of scholarly gravitas, while beneath it a predator lurked, feeding on the vulnerable, twisting knowledge into a weapon. He targeted specific students, didn't he? I inquired, my voice hoarse. Those who were getting too close to his own research, perhaps just those he deemed suitable for his experiments. The detective sighed, running a hand over his face. Yes, the others, more recent, were chosen for similar reasons or simply because they fit his pattern. He saw them as offerings. The word hung in the air, heavy and sickening. Offerings. Not people, not lives, but mere components in his deranged pursuit of academic immortality. The revelation wasn't a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, agonizing dawning, like watching a bruise spread across the skin. I had been looking for a stranger, a cult, a hidden society, when the monster was sitting at the head of the table all along. The detective placed a hand on my shoulder. I closed it, user ooh. I stopped him. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of a nearby cabinet. My face was pale, smudged with something I didn't want to identify, my eyes wide and haunted. At what cost? I murmured, more to myself than to him. The victims' faces flashed in my mind, their vibrant lives extinguished for a madman's legacy. The institution itself, once a beacon of knowledge, now felt tainted, its very foundations built on hypocrisy and buried secrets. I walked over to the table where the professor's tools still lay, the chisels, the small, sharp saws, the meticulous implements of his craft. They were innocent objects, designed for discovery, for understanding. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of a scalpel. This place, the County Morgue Autopsy Suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, had always been my sanctuary, a place where the dead spoke to me, where I could find clarity amidst chaos. The pursuit of truth, I realized, wasn't always clean, wasn't always redemptive. Sometimes it just left you with the bitter taste of what humanity was capable of, even its most esteemed members. What now? The case was closed. Justice, in its grim, procedural way, would be served. But for me, the resolution felt less like a triumph and more like the end of a long, arduous excavation, revealing not gold but a cavern of despair. Could I ever look at academia the same way? Could I ever trust the pursuit of knowledge without also fearing its perversion? My gaze settled on a small, intricate bone fragment I'd been examining earlier, part of a victim's shattered wrist. It told a story of resistance, of a final, desperate struggle. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. And I, user ooh, was still their voice. The scars would remain, undoubtedly, but so would the resolve. I had failed once, but not again, not ever again.